Over the next 45 minutes, Agatha and I will talk about global supply chains in a post-COVID-19 world, and we will structure our conversation along three broad lines. In the first part, we will talk generally about global supply chains. We shouldn't forget that already in 2018 and 2019, we saw a rising rivalry between the US and China. We all remember the trade conflict last year. And then, of course, in early 2020 came the COVID-19 shock. We will talk about what this all will mean for our highly optimized global supply chains for the future. And then in the second part, we will talk a bit more specifically about some strategic industries where there are calls from politicians to bring back production and supply chains in strategically important industries. And then in the third part, we will talk about some ethical questions that companies more and more are faced with when dealing with China, be it in relation to Hong Kong or be it in relation to Xinjiang. We have talked with two experts also before this session, with Jörg Wuttke, who is the chairman of the EU Chamber of Commerce in Beijing, and with René Buchholzer, the CEO of Interpharma here in Switzerland. And I will show brief segments of their conversation while we speak. But without further ado, Agatha, I would like to hear from you. What we saw in those past months was a big shock to our highly optimized supply chains. Having seen these disruptions over the past few months, what will this mean for our supply chains in the future? What will have to be done to make our supply chains more robust?
Thank you very much, Mark. And thank you, Katharina, for inviting me to speak here today. I'm delighted to be here. I want to extend the question a little bit, Mark, from COVID to integrate what you already mentioned, which is the issue of US-China decoupling, because I think those two trends are playing a role in our reconsideration, especially in Europe, but across the world, of value chain resilience, and value chain security in different ways with different impact in the long term. So I think it's very important when we think about the way that we'll rethink our value chain in the future to take into account the impact of both of those trends. They have a very different time span is one thing I want to say first and foremost. The US-China dispute is a long-term and progressive process, which, contrary to many people's belief, actually predates the Trump administration and Trump's election and will outlast him, whether or not he's re-elected this year. On the contrary, COVID, of course, is a one-off shock with extreme intensity, but within a limited time and a very different set of consequences. It affects players differently. US-China trade war hurt manufacturers that were exporting to the US first and foremost. And the US-China tech war and tech decoupling was highly tilted and highly impacting technological industries first and foremost. COVID hurts everyone across the board. Firms with operation in China, firms with operation throughout the world. And here I'm going to focus on China today because that's my area of focus. But of course, COVID has an impact on much more than China. Both of those events are increasing, and this is what links them together. They're increasing the perceived and actual cost and perceived and actual risk of doing business in China and on relying on extremely globalized value chains. The risk from both are just higher today than they were, 6 months ago for COVID and 3 years ago, 4 years ago for US-China decoupling. Interestingly, and in a way, COVID is actually a natural experiment for decoupling. For example, the US suspended travel and student flows from China, which is something that some of the most extreme decouplers on the US side of things had been trying to do or trying to justify for a number of years. So COVID actually puts and sets in motion for a short amount of time US-China decoupling to a certain extent and in certain dimensions. And so after COVID, some of those kind of longer term decoupling moves actually become more conceivable. Yet as it stands, and if, as a matter of fact, COVID recedes this year, and this is still an open question, unfortunately, but if COVID recedes this year, my argument, and this is why I wanted to bring US-China decoupling back into the picture, I think US-China decoupling will have a longer term and more important effect on value chains. COVID, and we'll hear it from Jörg Wuttke in your video, I believe, COVID might push certain companies to rethink contingency plan and supply chain resilience, but it also puts companies, at least for the time being and for a number of months, still in acute financial difficulties, with the focus on integration, probably consolidation, more so than expansion or diversification. We'll speak about that, but it's very costly to rearrange and readjust your value chains. US-China tension, on the other hand, and on the contrary, have a more continued and progressive effect, impacting companies and value chains in the longer run. And it might happen, and it will certainly happen, that the US will continue and double down on measures disrupting the operation of certain tech value chains, certain manufacturing value chains, certain service value chain for that matter, through FDI screening measure, export control measures, et cetera, et cetera. And so as a result, and interestingly, we've got a few figures that come out and have come out over the past few weeks about what COVID did and will potentially do to value chains versus what US-China decoupling did and will likely do to value chains. And while current surveys that are being conducted in China show that there's actually little intention to reshuffle value chain at the moment in a COVID environment for reasons of uncertainty, for reasons of a lack of liquidity, foreign and Chinese companies in China had actually signaled before COVID that they were considering moving value chains outside of China in light of US-China tensions. So I just want to put it out there that COVID is actually more push to consolidation, regrouping, trying to understand what the state of the global economy will be like, whereas the US-China decoupling move is affecting companies across the board. Now, of course, and this is important to say here because we're going to hear once again Jörg Wuttke on the topic, I want to make it very clear that, and this will be my last point, it does not affect all firms equally. So what I've described about short-term versus long-term decoupling and reshuffling of value chains does not affect all firms equally, and it should not be taken as an across-the-board movement out of China. Some firms are actually more impacted, typically firms manufacturing for foreign markets, and especially the US market, much more impacted so than firms focusing on the Chinese market. And China's market has grown so much that a lot of the European US firms that are there and have value chains there have as their main objective selling to the Chinese market and won't be reconsidering their value chains. It's also important to see that tech firms will probably be more affected, especially US tech firms, but Europe tech firms as well, more affected than, say, simple consumer goods by US measures and decoupling, because the tech war is actually even more so important and long-lasting than the trade war in US-China tensions. And finally, and interestingly, it's possible and it's probable actually that US-China decoupling will affect earlier stages of production, R&D, and later stages of production, those that are typically subject to tariffs, more so than intermediary ones. And so it might be that value chains move in their earlier stages, in their later stages, and maybe not so much in the middle, where intermediary input can be continued and production can be continued in China. Some activities, of course, are also easier to move. It will depend on alternative markets and the ability of other countries to absorb production that China was focusing and the density of manufacturing that was taking place in China. It will depend on the types of goods produced. It's probably easier to shift low value added, say, garment or toys production to neighboring countries in Southeast Asia in particular. It's probably also easier, interestingly, to shift the highest levels of the value chain and value added back to advanced economies. Think about hyper capital intensive industries such as the higher value added pharma products, mechanical equipment, to countries such as countries in Europe, in the US, Japan or South Korea that have a very large pool of qualified workers, and where mechanization, for example, or robotization is justified because of the high level of capitalization. And finally, it will depend on the nature of firms' involvement in China. If they're in tech, it's much easier to bring teams back home, but heavy industrial plants such as the BASF's 10 billion plant in China is a sunk cost, and it's a huge investment that you won't be moving from one day to the other. So those are the main kind of remarks I wanted to make up front about the complexity of understanding how value chains will change, how the US-China decoupling picture is actually a longer term one probably than COVID, and how value chains will change very much depending on which industry and which segment of the value chain you're in.
You mentioned that the US-China decoupling has predated Donald Trump, and it will be with us, with whoever the next president will be. This is a long-term issue. Now, I remember when the trade conflict started in 2017, 2018, many people said, well, you know, this is mainly rhetorics. These economies are so intertwined, they are so dependent on each other, there will not be a real decoupling. Share with us a few of your thoughts. How will this decoupling really play out? Will these two largest economies in the world really shift away from each other?
Well, the first thing I want to say here is that those two economies have actually already started shifting away from each other. If you look at 2019 trade versus 2018 trend, for example, or 2016 trade versus 2019, to take the length of the data we've got on Donald Trump's presidency, you already see a notable decrease in trade, about 18 to 20%. And you see a notable, very, very stark actually, decrease in two-way investment, especially Chinese investment to the US, which has declined by as much as 90% since the height of 2016. A lot of that is to do with some domestic measures in China, but the movement or the decrease in Chinese investment and Chinese interest into the US market in terms of investment is really impressive and much starker than what we're seeing in Europe or the rest of the world. So I wanted to say as a first response that it's already happening, but we see it most and first and foremost in trade because of tariffs being imposed, also because of some export control measures that are being put in place. I can think about the ECRA regulation in particular, in terms of investment, because CFIUS, the committee that is in charge of vetting or looking over and scrutinizing inward investment, including from China, has been beefed up, has been revamped and reformed with towards much stricter application and scrutiny. But there are many other areas that we see new developments in. Think about Chinese procurement or Chinese selling of certain critical infrastructure in the US. A lot of measures have actually been put in place already to restrict and limit China's procurement of such kind of more critical components and more critical infrastructure on the US market. It's true of data. A lot of Chinese data companies, and especially with data crossing border, have seen barriers erected and heightened in the US over the past couple of years, and especially the last 6 months. There's talk now at the moment of financial decoupling even. So a reconsideration of Chinese firms listing on the US market, but also a reconsideration of US pension funds, investment funds, portfolio investment into China. And I'm missing a lot of examples here, but in terms of ideas, in terms of IP, in terms of student exchanges, R&D exchanges, this move is broad-based. It's happening at the moment, and there's much more to come. So in short, it did start before Donald Trump, and it most likely will continue after it, way beyond investment, way beyond trade, and way beyond value chains only.
Thank you. I will briefly show a video segment of our talk with Jörg Wuttke here. He shares his thoughts on what European companies are doing right now, European companies that are based in China, and what they're doing with their supply chains right now after the COVID shock.
It has led to the discussion of where should I diversify, where should I move to other places in order to safeguard this. But frankly, two things. One is Diversification, meaning to establish a second production site, is not on our radar at all. In a time of recession, when you're struggling to survive, the last thing you want is to add on fabrication possibilities. You'd rather close down than build up. Second, you don't have the management attention time right now to think about it. So my guess is on the supply chain future, this will be pretty much limited to areas which our policymakers indicate are strategic and are important for us in Europe. Pharmaceuticals, healthcare equipment, in order to see that these are closer to home and so forth, but they have to resolve an issue. Are our insurance companies willing to pay more? Because this is going to get more costly. In the European Chamber survey, which we launched last month, only 10% said they're considering to move supply chains.
Move out
of China. Consider, not doing it, considering it. If you look into the story of our survey, in 2011, it was a solid 22%. So with COVID and after all of this, there are less people willing to move than 9 years ago. And I think that says it all. China is just the growth story. You know, I indicated before that BASF believes 30% of global growth over the next 10 years will be in China. You have to be here. 30% stands for the entire growth potential of all the OECD countries combined. In chemicals, it's even more pronounced. It's 60% of global growth for the next 10 years. So if you're not at this table, you're on the menu. And so we have to really see that rerouting of supply chains happens in very singular cases where companies are targeting the US market. Many Chinese companies move out of China, rerouting the supply chain because they can't access the US market with labels of made in China. So what you see is that sort of some areas, be it high tech, be it socks and bras, moves the last stage of production out in order to be entitled to have the label of made in Vietnam, made in Bangladesh, made in Philippines. But the supply chain is not, to my knowledge, moving anywhere. The clusters in China are too competitive. The market potential in China is too big. So I think it's a niche discussion, except of course the security issues.
So basically, in a nutshell, what Jörg Wuttke, who is, besides being the president of the EU Chamber of Commerce, is also the chief representative of BASF in China. Basically, what he is saying, you just have to be in China. And most of the companies that he talks to, they say, we don't want to, or we can't even afford to move our supply chains out of China. If you're not in this market, you're on the menu, so to say. So how do you square this? On the one hand, that sort of the rising decoupling, the rising US-China decoupling issue, while at the same time, companies just have to be present in China and have to have their supply chains there.
Well, there's two responses to your question. The first one is that Jörg and BASF are in very specific industries. As we said, industries that are very capital intensive, and therefore a company and a bunch of companies that have made enormous investment in setting up factory and plants in China. So moving out for them, especially for BASF, is potentially most probably not an option, and understandably so. Some other segments, both of the value chains and some other sectors might be both more inclined, and it might be easier for them to move out of China. Think once again about more nimble tech companies that have mostly services on the ground, mostly employees on the ground, and not so much heavy capital, heavy investments and assets. So that's the first response to your question. The second is US-China decoupling, as I said, does not impact all firms, and it does not impact all firms equally. It targets specific manufacturers in the context of the Phase 1 deal, and it targets specific tech sectors that the US considers to be national security sensitive and relevant. And so chemicals and certain tech that aren't necessarily on the list of US's concern when it comes to national security will also be less constrained and less at risk of increased US measures on the sectors and on US-China flows of goods, of services, and of ideas and technologies. So that's really the main answer. At the end of the day, those companies and a lot of the companies that I think you represent haven't been as impacted by certain measures that the US has put in place for the moment. Not to say that broader moves like financial decoupling won't be more far-reaching if the US starts using the US currency as a trade war and tech war and decoupling tool. A lot of European companies might find themselves in a difficult place. But it's just a very nuanced picture because the effects both of COVID, but mostly and especially of US-China decoupling play very differently in different industries.
In the field of technology, we've seen in the past few weeks reports, for example, of Foxconn building up a second production line in India, which is kind of completely independent from its production line in China. Is that the kind of future that you see in the technology field, like completely independent production clusters?
So there are two trends that I think are relevant here. And I'm glad you bring this example up because it's a very important one, and especially Foxconn being such a typical China producing, China established company to start with. The first reaction there is that one of the moves, so there are both defensive and offensive moves on the US decoupling menu. And one of those moves is the idea of creating an economic prosperity network. So a network and an ensemble and a group of trusted partners, like-minded is one of the terms that usually comes up, like-minded partners that would be, say, quote unquote, safe places for value chains and safe places for production. And so when you see moves like this moving out into India from China or doubling down on India, it might be in reaction to thinking about which are the countries that are likely going to be targeted by the US and how do I produce in a country that I believe to be like-minded or preferred to the US in that case. So that's a very important development actually. And I think we might see a little bit more of that in certain technologies, and Foxconn is very high on the list of somewhat sensitive companies at the moment.
Now, when it comes to strategically important industries, we've heard calls from politicians in Europe, for example, to bring back strategically important production to Europe. It was the case that in Europe, we woke up realizing that we don't produce any facial masks here. A lot of our basic ingredients for pharmaceuticals are sourced in China and so on. So the pharmaceutical and healthcare industry is probably one of the industry that is being seen as strategically important. Before we get to the question, I will briefly show a video sequence that we recorded with René Buchholzer, the CEO of Interpharma.
I think we have to differentiate. Security of supply is not synonymous with self-sufficiency. As we know from agriculture market very well, for example, looking at Switzerland, and we will not be able to have self-sufficiency anyway, because we need some pre-products and raw material anyway in Switzerland and in most countries. And I would say almost all countries, maybe with very few exceptions, would not be in the position, just given their size, to put up all necessary drugs. And the third critical point is, what kind of drugs we're talking about? I mean, there was a lot of talk about propofol, for example, during this crisis, which was probably one of the substances most in the talk, at least within the European Union and in Switzerland. But normally when you prepare for a crisis, as we say, you prepare for the last war and not for the next war. So it's relatively not so easy to understand which products you will do. Would you just go for essential medicine, essential medicines of the WHO, or what you really talk about? I mean, therefore, I think theoretically, of course, you can decide to do that. it's just a question of price, because it's very clear that having your own production facility in small areas like Switzerland and maybe even within the EU, it's not enough in a way. And obviously the price would have to be paid basically by the taxpayer. So
basically, in a nutshell, what René Buchholzer is saying, it sounds good to bring back strategically important production such as pharmaceuticals, but you immediately run into scalability issues, price issues, and then the question, so what do you really want to source here? Do you want to go all the way to basic products, or do you just want to do essential medicine? What's your view on that? Is the idea to bring back strategically important production and supply chains to Europe? Is that even feasible?
So I think there are three main points here to underline and to respond to the question. The first one is we don't need to bring everything back, and I'll address that in a minute. The second one is if we do so, and when we do so, we need to acknowledge the cost and the constraints, which are pretty high. And then third is there are fortunately alternatives, and I'll speak to that very quickly. On the first point, not all needs to be brought back. On the contrary, we did an exercise at the Rhodium Group not long ago to look at how much of EU's trade with China is actually made up of what could be considered essential goods. We went into EU definition of essential goods, including food, energy, critical inputs for production, and pharmaceutical, of course, included in there. And when you look at the whole of those categories, which look like pretty important imports from China, those actually only make about 5% of our imports from China. And so it's already putting into perspective this idea that we should reshore everything. We don't need to reshore everything, even for just typical kind of essential goods. That would only concern 5% of our imports from China. I was looking at candidate Biden's supply chain proposal, and he adds to that list key electronics and related tech and semiconductors. That would increase the list, and that would increase the size a little bit more, but to be determined if we consider those to be essential goods. But even within those essential goods, what we just heard on the video is that even within pharma, we don't need to bring back everything. Not all drugs are needed as intensely, even in times of COVID. Not all drugs are essential or as essential as each other. So even within those clusters, there's a way to look at it that is narrower than just reshoring everything we consider to be essential. Of course, we do rely on China for other types of import that we might consider to be important, and that would expand the list. But what I want to say, and very quickly, is that at the end of the day, there's only a small subset of goods, like masks and PPEs, that are sensitive. Why? Because even within essential goods, and even within pharma, in the sectors that are the most important in times of COVID or in times of an emergency and a health emergency, a few of those and a minority of those are products that aren't necessarily produced from a diversified source of suppliers, or products that aren't at least partially produced in Europe. So at the end of the day, we had huge shortages in PPE, in masks, in certain pharma goods, but those were more the exception than they were the norm. So that's a very, very big question, and that's a very big debate to be had about what needs to be brought back and what really justify bringing back some of those goods where we might have other supply sources and where not all is needed, even in terms of crisis. The second thing is if we do, and if Europe moves in that direction, one needs to acknowledge the cost and one needs to acknowledge the constraints. In terms of cost, Jörg Wittpe was already pointing to a few of those, but I see 5 in particular. First one is, of course, sunk cost from existing investment. You're leaving behind a factory, you're leaving behind offices, and you're leaving behind a team that you've built over the years. The second type of cost is new cost for setting up new production. And that's what Jörg meant by setting up a second production plant, say in Vietnam, Bangladesh, and or for that matter in Switzerland. The third cost is the differentiated cost of production. You're not going to pay workers the same in Europe. You're not going to pay for inputs at the same prices in Europe. So that needs to be taken into account, of course. An important one and an important cost that many people sometimes don't take into account is also the environmental or social cost of certain dirtier or more labor-intensive productions that would need to either be accepted in Europe or be pushed up to standards and European standard, which is likely the preferred solution. And of course, and I just want to throw it in there, but it's an important one, there's a soft cost as well, and a longer term cost to decreasing interdependency, to decreasing society to society or economic to economic exchanges that can grow in the future with more mistrust potentially as a result. Beyond cost, and interestingly as well, I've reviewed a few studies that talk about the cost of reshoring. And it's not just the cost, it's also constraints that stand in the way. In short, the industrial commons that are needed to manufacture beyond your own little production plants, that has actually, to a certain extent, disappeared in Europe and in certain advanced economies. In many places in the OECD, the entire or part of the ecosystem for manufacturing is missing from years and years of outsourcing in China, from years and years of moving out manufacturing to other countries. That includes product design abilities, that includes supplier and partner bases in the country, which exist and are very strong in China. That includes a pool of skilled labor, and it doesn't mean just skilled, but it means skilled in your own area of expertise. I was rereading a case study of General Electric appliances trying to move back and reshore, I think it was 10 years ago, one of their China manufacturing plant into the US, and they realized that there was a lot of highly skilled labor where they were planning to set up the plant again. But in terms of the fundamental and very specific knowledge of how to put together water heaters, the skills had disappeared. And so a pool of skilled labor, but very specialized labor as well. And of course, logistical networks to ensure seamless distribution, R&D networks, and a strong environment for regulation and rules that you've learned to just manage and work with. And so in comparison, the constraint of reshoring compared to what exists in China at the moment, which is extremely compelling and which includes modern infrastructure, advanced logistics and know-how, a pretty highly evolved ecosystem of suppliers, a well-educated and very specialized labor force for all kinds of demand, and a large and growing domestic market, those constraints are extremely strong. So they need to be taken into account when thinking about reshoring, and especially when thinking about reshoring across the board, many industries. It's okay to kind of specialize and go with a narrow view, but if the approach is too broad, there is a high likelihood that we won't be able to digest all of it and absorb all of it all of a sudden. It's of course not impossible to grow and nurture some of those capacities, some of those networks back in Europe or in the US or in Japan, but it will take money, it will take incompressible time, and it will take costly efforts overall. It might also require, and this is an important note to make, a minimum threshold or a minimum number of companies to be reshoring at the same time, so that the industrial clusters that are needed, the transportation clusters, the logistical clusters, are recreated and reproduced, making life easier for manufacturers. But fortunately, and this is the last point I want to make, fortunately, there are also alternatives, of course, to reshoring. And if you take pharma, for example, as a case study, you could diversify production. This is really the first solution. You could diversify suppliers and diversify production in different countries. You could stockpile, and that's not an option for any type of pharma products. That's not an option for all pharma goods, but it is an option for certain and some of them. There's the option for certain sectors either to use dormant capacity in Europe and so have kind of standby production facilities, or to know, and it was the case, for example, hydroalcoholic gel, to know that you can turn certain factories into kind of backup and emergency factories. There was one very interesting case of Hermès, the French luxury good manufacturer, is turning its perfume factory into a hydroalcoholic factory, simply because that was pretty easy to do, and the same time of components and production mechanism for that were at play. On top of that, and this is exactly what the video was saying, security of supply is really different from self-sufficiency. So it's not necessary, and it's not to be the main objective or the overall objective to be self-sufficient. What we onshore or we reshore, what we decide to diversify, what we decide to mitigate against, needs to get us to security of supply, and self-sufficiency is probably not the right objective. So those are the main comments I would say.
If we now move to the last part, which circles around ethical questions that companies present in China more and more have to deal with. In the past few weeks, we of course had all the headlines about the new security law in Hong Kong, and we have ongoing issues with China's actions in Xinjiang. Let me ask you first, given the most recent developments, what kind of future role do you see for Hong Kong? Is the role that Hong Kong has played in the past years as a bridge between, let's say, the Western world and the People's Republic of China, is that bridge function over? Or what role can Hong Kong play?
It's of course very hard to say, because the law is so young, and because, because a lot of the consequences still have to be defined. But it is really hard to think that the national security law won't have deep consequences on businesses' decision to use Hong Kong as a base or as an operation hub. And as a matter of fact, I was looking at recent surveys. AmCham ran a survey last week that showed that nearly a third of US companies in Hong Kong are considering shifting part of their business out of the city, although only a small fraction of them expect to leave altogether. So it's more still risk diversification and risk hedging, moving out some parts of their business. 76% said that they were concerned, of course, about the legislation, and that seems pretty obvious and pretty normal. But the biggest kind of takeaway, I think, is that 48% said that they were considering leaving in the medium to long term. So in the short term, there's still time for reorganization, risk hedging, but at the end of the day, the hit on Hong Kong is likely to be really high.
When it comes to Xinjiang, we had last week we had a media report that said that Caterpillar, the US producer of heavy trucks and so on, they were found that they had sourced clothes actually from a company in Xinjiang that had used forced labor. And on this topic, we also have a video segment with Jörg Wuttke, which I will show in 1 second.
My company has 2 major plants in Xinjiang. We have done an audit, we have done an external audit, and we are trying to be prepared. We are trying to understand where our products are heading. We try to understand where our joint venture partner is operating. I think we have done all the homework. We also communicated this to NGOs and to the Green Party in particular in Germany. So I think that really requires companies' action. So don't put the head in the sand, don't play ostrich. Really aggressively go into this, force your company to do this, which is very difficult. Supply chains to ask your customer and your customer's customer to basically certify that they don't have forced labor. Good luck on this one. But I can only say, don't wait for things to happen. There is an Australian study that is available. It mentions a lot of European companies, also American companies. Luckily, BASF is not part of that. These companies on the list cannot hide. They have to do the supply chain checkup, and they have to draw conclusions if they continue dealing with Xinjiang, which is really difficult because Xinjiang is not just barren land and a plot where you have coal, sand, and gas in the earth. Xinjiang is the textile center of China. That's where all the cotton, that's where all the chemical fibers come from. So, you know, it ends up in the wardrobes of Switzerland. And so you better look into this stuff.
So basically what he's saying, you know, Xinjiang is not just a piece of desert in the far west of China. It's the garment production center of China. A lot of textiles are being produced there that end up in our wardrobes. What's your view on how companies can and should deal with supply chain issues in Xinjiang in particular?
So I think there's two main risks to companies when it comes to Xinjiang. The first one is a risk of public opinions. The increased visibility of those issues in the press, the increased sensitivities of public opinion in Europe in particular around the issue of Xinjiang will put companies found to be dealing in Xinjiang, and I'll define that in a minute, to be present in Xinjiang in one way or another and remotely or directly under pressure. The second aspect and the second threat, of course, is sanctions. And the US is mulling a number of measures on Xinjiang. There are some beginning or start of discussions in Europe about what to do about Xinjiang as well, and potentially with some measures being taken, probably not as drastic or strong as in the US. But in any case, those two threats are going to come down on companies that have operations or are dealing with Xinjiang. And what I mean here is not only having a production plant on the ground, certainly not. It's not enough to retreat your direct operations there, but I think companies, and this is what Jörg was saying, companies will need to do a full audit of their suppliers, of their partners, of their clients, and probably not at the first level only, but probably at the second and potentially third level as well. The suppliers of their suppliers, making sure that those are not involved in human rights violations, forced labor, and other kind of illegal activities and unethical activities in Xinjiang.
We have to come to a close. Time is almost up, but let me allow to ask a last question that was asked by one of the participants, and that again looks a bit further into the future. Do you believe that the likely new normal in a post-COVID-19 world, in terms of physical interaction and diplomatic relation, will seriously hamper the speed and scale of China's Belt and Road Initiative? In other words, has the Belt and Road Initiative suffered a serious blow by COVID-19?
My main concern, and I'll be fast on that because it's one of my topic of expertise or kind of research. But my main take on the Belt and Road Initiative in light of COVID is not so much on the diplomacy that China has deployed in COVID times. It's not so much on the mass diplomacy, but it's on the sustainability of the Belt and Road Initiative and some of the projects and investments and lending, especially loans extended in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative, that are going to come under light and under the spotlight with BRI. We had done a research at the Rhodium Group looking at all cases of Chinese debt renegotiations in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative. And pre-COVID had already found that $1 in $5 that China has extended and lent along the Belt and Road Initiative had come under trouble and had to be renegotiated because it wasn't sustainable and because the recipient country ran into difficulties repaying the loan. Imagine with COVID, you've got countries that are facing a decrease in tourism, a decrease in commodity trade, a decrease in fiscal resources and revenues, running into acute financial difficulties. And so what we're looking and what's coming towards us and towards Chinese negotiators, Chinese banks and Chinese authorities is really a huge wave of debt renegotiation. And I think that will be the main takeaway from COVID for the Belt and Road Initiative, that it's going to highlight, it's going to increase, and it's going to make extreme some of the unsustainable patterns that had characterized the initiative before COVID, with a lot of debt renegotiation on the agenda. We already have 10 countries almost that have declared that they need to be renegotiating their debt with China in light of COVID, and we expect that to happen much more in the future.
Okay, with that, unfortunately, again, we have to come to a close. Time is up, but thank you first. Thank you very much, Agatha, for your insight. This was highly interesting. Let me briefly just share my screen with you again. In coming to a close, I would like to highlight both the Asia Society, which offers you to become a member. You can just scan this QR code. It's a great organization. We've been working with Asia Society for many years. I can highly recommend it. And of course, slightly biased, being from the market, I can highly recommend to become a subscriber of the market as well. Also, again, just scan the QR code for further information about that. With that, thank you all very much and have a great afternoon.